everybody. My name's Helen, and I've been at Sunbridge now for nearly a year. So I come with my husband Ken, who's sitting over there, and our two kids. We've really enjoyed being part of the fellowship here. Luke asked me to talk on this subject this evening because I don't work for any particular political party or anything like that, so I'm not party political as such. But I work for a public affairs agency. And what we do is we work with different clients. So we actually just work with charities, we're a not-for-profit, and help them to know how best to kind of engage with politicians and other kind of political actors to help be able to kind of deliver change for the people that they work with. So, that could be, for at the moment, I'm doing a lot of work around kind of refugee and asylum issues. So kind of working with a charity to help them know how to kind of influence. There's a big bill currently going through Parliament to help them to know how to influence that, to help them to try and push to amend that, and actually to try and push for that to not go through. In other cases, kind of working more with people working in government, so maybe civil servants, the Department of Health, for example, and working with them to make sure that government policy kind of works for a particular group of people, and kind of represents their interests. So that's my job. It's not the easiest to explain. If you've got any questions, you can ask me afterwards. Or maybe another day, might be the time. So just quickly, next slide please, Matt. So the aim is for this to be quite interactive. I'm going to cover kind of 3 broad areas this evening, and I'll kind of share some thoughts, I suppose, based on my kind of experiences, and then give you a chance to kind of sit in your tables and chat. So firstly, kind of why should we be engaging in politics kind of as Christians? Secondly, kind of what sort of issues should we be engaging on? And kind of finally, what are some of the practical ways that we can do that? But just initially, maybe there's quite a lot of people here tonight, maybe some different faces. So just kind of take 1 or 2 minutes and just turn to the people on your table. If you haven't done it already, you may well have done, just introduce yourself and just briefly discuss this question: why are you here tonight, and what interests you about this topic? So I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes. Great, I hope you had some good conversations and met some new people, so double bonus there. I just want to kind of briefly talk about why we should engage in politics. Partly, obviously from a Christian perspective, just touching kind of briefly on what the Bible says about that, but also why, this particular moment in time is important, I think, that we engage in politics as Christians. Next slide, please, Matt. And just before we go into that, I just thought it might be helpful just to kind of give you some definitions. So I'm probably going to talk fairly interchangeably about policy or politics, just because I've kind of always worked more in policy, so I thought it might be helpful just to define it and show that it's not so different. Policy is defined as a principle or course of action undertaken by a governing body. So that can be anything from a new law, like I was talking about, or a kind of strategy that's produced by a government department, for example, a workforce plan. There's recently been a new workforce plan published for the NHS. But it can also include kind of what happens at a local level, so kind of planning guidance that can be produced from local authorities. And then politics is more kind of activities that happen to try and influence that, so to try and change it, to try and change those policies, whether that's at a national level or more of a local level. And policymakers, it can be anybody kind of from the Prime Minister or MPs, kind of through to civil servants. Because even though the Prime Minister might set a really high level of detail on policy, a really high level policy, a lot of that detail will be set by people working within government departments. So there's a whole bunch of people that you might need to influence. And then obviously at a local level, councils have a lot of autonomy in certain areas, and also you get kind of NHS and education bodies. So there's quite a lot of people that kind of in my role I'm involved in influencing, and I think kind of we can think about influencing as a church. Next slide, please. So why should we engage in politics? Well, I think the Bible kind of makes it clear that we should be in the world and kind of engaged in the world, and we should be active participants in that. And I think kind of politics and policy has a lot of impact on our lives in different ways. It has an impact in terms of really practical ways, so thinking about the building project and planning guidance and kind of what goes into that and what you need to kind of demonstrate as part of that. That's kind of policy that's produced like at a national level, but also locally. Also issues around like freedom of speech that can impact us Christians, how we share our faith and whether we can share our faith, and the ways that we can do that. That's obviously impacted by government policy. And also I think at particular times, individuals within our community will be particularly impacted by big changes in policy. As I said, I've been kind of working a lot recently in kind of asylum policy, and there's a big bill going through at the moment which have a real impact on people, particularly going forwards, coming to this country to seek sanctuary. So I think that's kind of really relevant to people. It impacts people at different stages in our community as well. Next slide, please. And yeah, what does the kind of Bible say about why we should engage in like policy and politics? And I'm not going to go into kind of great detail on this. I think we've been doing Romans as a church recently, and Matthew did a really good sermon a few weeks ago in Romans 13, which I would recommend if you've not listened to it. But I think what that does say is it makes it very clear that there is a validity in terms of human authorities, that they're put by God, and that we should kind of respect them, as long as what they're asking us to do doesn't directly go against God. And I think there's real space for kind of constructive engagement, given like the influence they have on so many areas of our lives. I think, you know, we're also called to be kind of salt and light in the world, and I think there's a real kind of void in a number of areas of politics at the moment, in terms of like godly wisdom, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to be light in that arena, as there are in so many other kind of arenas of life. Next slide, please, Matt. And I think there's also lots of examples in the Bible about how people kind of serve authorities. I think there's lots of good examples of people that are kind of use their positions in terms of authority to make positive changes, and how God can kind of use that as well. I've just kind of put some examples there. So there's Esther, Daniel, Obadiah, Joseph. So obviously Joseph, he was given a real position of authority in Egypt, and that enabled him to really bless his family, and God really used that. So I think that's a demonstration that God can really use people Christians in authority. But obviously, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, you know, there may be times that we have to, you know, we always have to submit to God above submitting to the authorities. So even within those examples, there was kind of limits. But I think, you know, the Bible kind of makes it clear that, yeah, as I said, we should be kind of engaging in the world and engaging in this area, and there's a real opportunity for us to do that in lots of different ways. Next slide, please. And I think like now is a particularly important time. It's always a kind of, you know, I think it's always a good time to engage in politics. But we are kind of looking at a general election next year. So there has to be a general election by the end of 2024. It could be as early as like March next year, or it could be kind of later. And you know, I think the chances are we will have a change in government. It's looking likely that there'll be a change from the current Conservative government that we've had for quite a long time to a Labour government, but there's kind of no real certainty in that. I think it's going to be very close. So yeah, it's definitely a good time for us to be thinking and engaging as in terms of what we do in terms of our votes for that. And I think also, I think there's kind of some very worrying trends in politics that I've kind of observed from the work that I do, and a real space for like godly wisdom and integrity. I'm sure, you know, many of us, obviously, we've all kind of lived through the pandemic, and I think, unfortunately, there were kind of a number of examples of the way politicians behaved during that maybe demonstrate a lack of integrity, you know, Partygate, etc. I think there's definitely a space for Christian wisdom to fill that void. And one of the things I've really noticed in my job over the last kind of, particularly over the last year or so, is there's an increasing like lack of scrutiny, particularly in Parliament. You know, the government kind of increasingly wants to, if they want to make something happen, it's getting kind of rushed through Parliament with very limited time for debate, and I think, yeah, there's been a couple of examples of that on kind of key policy, and some key policy around strikes, and also most recently the kind of asylum bill that's going through. So yeah, kind of a real sense that there's maybe a lessening influence of like broader parliament, which I think is quite worrying. And I think something that maybe has been happening for a while and kind of continues to happen is the increasing power of the media, and also the kind of increasing reliance on polls. So, you know, particularly in a tight election, I think people target the people that they want to vote for them, and then increasingly policy is determined by what you think those people want you to say, rather than necessarily kind of reason, debate and logic and intelligent thought. So yeah, so I think, and also the other thing just finally is there's a real kind of lack of like policy making happening. You know, there's kind of big laws that are set, but the lack of thought going into like the detail, you know, particularly you know, departments such as the Home Office, it feels like they're constantly like shifting in the wind in terms of their policy, and there's no real thought going into the detail of that. And yeah, as I said, the reason I've said that is it just feels like there is a bit of a void in terms of wisdom, in terms of integrity, in terms of you know, really thinking through, you know, why are we kind of making these policies, why are we making these decisions, how can we ensure that they actually, the government does what it should do and kind of works in the best interests of people. And I feel like that's a space that Christians kind of step into. So yeah, how can we respond to that? Well, obviously we can, in the context of elections, general elections coming up, I think we can make kind of godly decisions about who we vote for, and I'll kind of go into a bit more detail on that at the end. Yeah, and as I said, I feel like there's a real need for kind of godly wisdom in politics. Yeah, and I think kind of thinking about ways that we can support those that are kind of in politics, or ways that we kind of engage ourselves, you know, both as like a church, but also individually. Next slide, please. So yeah, I was going to ask you to turn back onto your tables now and just think about these two questions. Why do you think it is important, or not, that we engage in politics? I'm kind of assuming you might think it's important if you come this evening, but feel free to express a different opinion and have grace. And how can our faith and God's wisdom in the Bible help us to do that? So I'll give you maybe kind of 5-10 minutes to do that. So now I just want to talk a little bit about what we should engage on. So I suppose maybe we could kind of broadly split issues into, I suppose, what issues Christians might typically say are kind of moral issues, or issues that might directly impact our ability to practice or to share our faith. So maybe issues like around the sanctity of life, abortion, euthanasia, freedom of speech, which can impact, laws around freedom of speech can impact our ability to preach the gospel or share the gospel. Obviously issues around kind of sexuality, about teaching in schools, marriage, discrimination that Christians might face. So we can kind of look at those issues potentially as a group, and often those are the kind of issues that Christians are maybe more likely to engage on. And then there's obviously kind of broader issues, so issues such as health, you know, education, economic policy, environmental policy, which may kind of impact all of us, I suppose, in different ways at different times, and also have big impacts on our kind of broader society. So yeah, so I think we can kind of broadly think about those two kinds of issues. And yeah, I just wanted to think a bit about kind of what we should be kind of engaging on as a church. Should we kind of just focus on those kind of initial issues, or should we be kind of engaging more broadly in a much kind of larger spectrum of issues as well? I just wanted to kind of cover a little bit about, oh sorry, next slide. Kind of political parties and where they stand on these issues. Like I'm sure most of you are kind of familiar with the major political parties in this country. So we also have the Conservative Party, who are currently in government and have been in government for a little while, kind of led by Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, and then the Labour Party, who are currently led by Keir Starmer. And as I said, in terms of like the next election, it's looking like most likely it will be Labour, but I think it's still like that up in the air. And then there's a number of kind of smaller political parties as well, so the Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party, who also operate in UK Parliament, not just in Scotland, Green Party, and a few others. So that's kind of the broad makeup of our political system. And I would kind of say on like these moral issues, particularly as like parties, they're kind of broadly on the same page on most of these issues nowadays. There's not much kind of differentiation at like a party level. But that saying, there probably is still variation between like individuals within those parties, and often people are still given the freedom to vote as a wish on these issues, vote with conscience on those kind of moral issues that we're talking about. And I think on broad issues, maybe there is kind of bigger variation between policies. For example, on the NHS and education, there probably is a bit of a broader difference between what the Conservatives and the Labour Party and some of the smaller parties kind of think on those issues. But yeah, I think it's just kind of useful to just have that understanding. And I think maybe what that means is that maybe at some point in the past, and I'm sure everybody has different opinions on this, it might have been easier to think, well, I'm a Christian, this is where I stand on certain issues, okay, I should kind of vote for this party because they seem to be more kind of on the same page in terms of those issues. And I think that's probably not true anymore. It's more about kind of actually getting to know the individuals as much as you can, and whether they kind of currently stand on issues that kind of are important to you, both in terms of kind of moral issues, but also in terms of broader issues. And actually we're having a conversation on our table, and it reminded me, so that actually there are lots of ways that you can do that. There's lots of stuff. The advantage of living in this modern age is that actually, basically everything your MP has ever said in Parliament is recorded, and you can look at it, you can look at what they're saying on social media, and you can also look at kind of exactly how they voted on like every bill and every amendment to every bill that's gone through Parliament. So actually we do have that gift of a lot of information, which enables us, from the comfort of our own homes, to be able to make, I suppose, informed choices about our MPs. You can also go and meet them as well. But yeah, that was useful just to mention. And I think just in terms of these like broader issues, I just wanted to highlight a case study that relates to some of the work that I've currently been doing. I suppose as a way to just kind of encourage us to be thinking about engaging a bit more on some of these broader issues. So at the beginning of the year, I think it was the end of last year actually, the Prime Minister kind of stood up and made like 5 pledges about the 5 issues that he was going to really focus on before the next election. And one of them was this issue. You may well have seen this slogan in newspapers and stuff: stop the boats. So kind of really trying to reduce people coming here via channel crossings primarily, but slightly more than that. And in order to do that, they've introduced a new bill, the Illegal Migration Bill, and this is currently speeding its way through Parliament, and actually the next couple of weeks are quite crucial in terms of adequacy on this. And what this bill will effectively do is make the claims of anybody who comes in via an unofficial route. So basically, if you're not kind of coming in on the Ukraine scheme or some of the Afghan schemes, inadmissible, which means that actually you won't be able to claim asylum in this country. And people will, the idea behind the bill is that people will be deported to a safe kind of third country, such as Rwanda. But it was interesting, the High Court ruled last week that maybe Rwanda isn't the safest country for people to go to, so they can't actually currently send people. But I won't get to those. And it's going to, the outcome of this will be that you will see, increase in people in indefinite detention, effectively, because many of us will know of issues with hotels and people being held for long times in hotels. The government's now looking for other options, so whether that's barges or military barracks, kind of other forms of accommodation. And I think something that's quite worrying about this bill is it explicitly states that they're not sure whether it kind of complies with the UK's international obligations, particularly around human rights, but also around the Refugee Convention. Obviously this is kind of a very specific area, one that you can probably tell I have quite a strong opinion on. But I think just kind of highlighting this because it's an example that I'm very familiar with. And I think just, why would this be relevant to us as Christians? And I think, the Bible teaches us about treating other people with love, about welcoming strangers, teaches us that all people are equal in God's eyes. And, there's a number of examples in the Bible where we see that God's people were refugees, including Jesus. Yeah, and I think, and obviously it impacts people in our church community here, and also in our community in Bradford. And I think it has been quite interesting. There has been quite strong Christian opposition to this in the House of Lords in particular, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who isn't known for necessarily taking a strong position on these things, has taken a very strong position on this. So that's good to see. Yeah, and I suppose there's other kind of broader topics which we may kind of want to engage with or have an opinion on as Christians. Obviously the cost of living, and the measures that we take to address that, because that obviously impacts a lot of people within our community here. Global warming. Like my husband and I, we lived in overseas for a while. We really saw the impact, like firsthand, of like air pollution and the impact that has on so many people, kind of across the globe. This is Sudan here, so kind of political situations across the world. And obviously here in this country, currently strikes, they'll represent issues in the NHS and education, and they will impact people within our broader communities. I'm not saying that we should necessarily spend all of our time kind of thinking about or being proactive on these issues, but I think just kind of being aware that there are a number of issues that kind of impact us as Christians, and there's probably real value in having kind of godly wisdom, and it feels like the Bible potentially has to say something about all of these issues, as well as the kind of moral issues, which are also very important. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it'd be great if you could kind of just go back into your tables and kind of discuss briefly what issues do you think we should engage on as Christians, and maybe what does the Bible have to say on some of these broader issues. Great, I'll give you 5 minutes or so. How can we engage? I promise this will be very good. So yeah, assuming that tonight's got you thinking, actually I think from the conversations we're having at our table, this is a topic that a lot of people are already thinking about and are already kind of engaging in certain ways. But I just wanted to kind of highlight a few ways that you can do that. I think sometimes one of the challenges with this area is that maybe people feel like they can't do anything, and even if they do something, it's not going to have any impact. But I don't think that is necessarily true. I think often what happens, and actually we're kind of talking about a few other examples around kind of shifting dates on abortion, etc. recently, is that because people don't really do anything, they don't really engage, they don't really draw attention to things that are kind of being rushed through, there's no debate on it, and things are kind of more likely to happen. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight kind of some of the ways that we can engage if we'd kind of like to do that following on from this. So obviously we can vote. I think I was saying this earlier, we can be very considered in who we vote for in the upcoming national election and also in kind of local elections. Take the time to get to know your candidates. Maybe don't vote the way you've always voted, or you can vote the way you've always voted, but kind of do that in a way where you really think that through. So kind of meet with them, write to them, look at what they've kind of said in Parliament, look at what they're saying on Twitter, which obviously is the medium so many people use nowadays. So you can do that in terms of voting, and I think just generally it's really important to kind of engage with our, consider engaging with our kind of local councillors and our local representatives on issues that are important to them. Actually, there's lots of ways, lots of organisations kind of make that really easy nowadays. There's lots of kind of template letters that you can often send and kind of click a button and slightly personalise it and send it to your councillor. I actually did this recently to my MP and got I literally got a reply within 2 minutes, and I have to say it wasn't the best reply, but it does show. It made me very angry, and I had to archive it. But it does show that they do react and they do respond, and they are interested in what people have to say to them. And I think particularly, around times when there's elections coming up, etc., they're very keen to be getting support So yes, I think it is important to engage with our elected representatives, and also there's opportunities to lots of organisations like Christian Institute in terms of kind of specifically kind of some of those more kind of Christian issues, but lots of other organisations do a lot of really powerful advocacy on different topics. They provide a lot of really great resources that you can use, and also you can financially support those organisations, or you can kind of join into calls to action. So that might be kind of signing petitions, that might be like physically going somewhere and protesting. You can write to your MP, as I already said. Yeah, and there's often lots of stuff happening around social media. So there are lots of opportunities to kind of engage through organisations that are already active in this area. Yeah, and I suppose another way is often when there's a big change happening, either at national level or local level, there will be public consultations and opportunities for people to write in, or maybe to like sometimes there'll be online, in-person events where you can go and you can represent your opinion and engage with the kind of elected representatives that are there, or civil servants that are running those. And I suppose finally, I'm going to consider whether or not you would like to be involved in public service of some kind, and that doesn't necessarily mean you need to run to be an MP. There's lots of opportunities at different levels. It could be being involved as a councillor, or maybe even like being a school governor at your school. There's all sorts of different areas where there's like policies being made that can impact us and our communities, and it'd be amazing if we had like Christian voice at all those different levels. I think that was everything I was going to say. Sorry, the last slide. Oh yeah, I've just flagged a couple of different resources there. So yeah, the Christian Institute, they do lots of influencing work, advocacy work on some more of those kind of issues, I suppose, that directly impact Christians, but also kind of issues, kind of moral issues that we were talking about earlier. And there's lots of opportunities to get engaged in their work and also to understand maybe things that are happening at the moment. And then also Christians in Politics, I think they're like slightly broader and just have a lot of resources that kind of talk through why we should think about being involved in politics, and also provide a bit more of a kind of in-depth insight in terms of what the key political parties are doing. Yeah, so last slide, please. Yeah, so that's it really. That was kind of everything I was going to cover, but maybe we could like just spend a few minutes just praying in our tables. Yeah, praying obviously for our kind of response to this, but also really praying for our elected representatives here in Bradford, our council, our MPs, but also at a national level as well. So maybe spend 5 minutes or so doing that.